What's up, everyone, and welcome to my top 5 games of 2022. As a few sort of reminders just to kick things off, this list of games that I'm going to cover in terms of what's eligible is not actually games that were necessarily released in 2022, but just games that I played in 2022. Thing number 2, these are games that I myself enjoy the most, and in some cases I think there are actually objectively better games listed in my honorable mentions rather than my main top 5 list, just because I didn't enjoy them as much, and maybe they, there's a thing like when a game has a certain level of polish, it sort of sands away some of the personality potentially, and so not saying that's the case with any games on my list, but it's certainly a possibility. And then finally, thing number 3 for just an intro to this video. My request to you is if you're watching this and see any games that you enjoy, please give them a look. I'm going to be linking all of the Steam pages to all of these games in the description. So if one of these games sounds interesting to you, my hope with this video, my sole hope, is that I help you find a game that you enjoy, because all of these games, in my opinion, are worth playing and games that I enjoyed, and hopefully you might too. So, without further ado, let's get into the honorable mentions. All right, first honorable mention. So these are games that did not make my top 5 list, but were very much enjoyable, and in other years could have very easily made my top 5, but it was a pretty good year. First up in honorable mentions is Kena, Bridge of Spirits. If you don't know this game, you might immediately notice why it's interesting, and that is the animation. So the background behind this game is that it was an animation studio that became or was made into a game studio. So a lot of the developers actually have a background in traditional movie and or gaming animation. And so one of the things you might immediately notice from the visuals of the trailer that's playing is that they are really damn good. So not only is the art direction for this game phenomenal, but the actual cutscenes, the in-game animation is on par with, I think, some of the best animation in the entire industry. And I'm not talking just about games. I would include movies here as well. The flip side of that is I think the gameplay is a little bit rougher, but honestly, it was kind of better than I expected. The game feel, I think, could use a little bit of work in the combat, but this is a 3D platform, action platformer in the most traditional sense, I think almost old school in the design. So things like Zelda, Okami, or Jak and Daxter, for example, very old school. Honestly, the gameplay is pretty fine, but I don't think it would be a noteworthy game if it wasn't for the visuals. And I think if you're someone who's interested in animation at all, I think this is an absolutely must play. But because the gameplay didn't live up as much to me personally, it did not make my top 5 list. But a fantastic game, as with everything else, do recommend. Next up in honorable mentions is God of War Ragnarok. So this is a game that I think a lot of people will be surprised as an honorable mention as opposed to being on the top 5. This was at the Game Awards neck and neck with Elden Ring for Game of the Year. And I just want to be transparent. I actually think this is one of the best video games ever made, if not actually the best video game ever made. So if you hear that, you're probably like, why the fuck didn't it make my top 5 list? And honestly, the simple reason is that I played the first one. And I felt that even though the sequel made a lot of very tangible steps to improve the game in a lot of significant ways, I do think objectively the sequel is better. I just found the first game more enjoyable personally, and I think some of that may be due to the surprise factor of this old IP getting completely unrecognizably revived in a way that was incredible. When God of War came out, the original one, or I guess the new generation of the original one, it was my favorite game that year. So I have a lot of love for this series, and to be honest, I will probably play every single God of War that they make. And I will happily do so. But I think it lost a little bit of its charm in that it didn't necessarily do anything crazy new that the first didn't. It just improved and iterated in a lot of ways. And honestly, that's fine. But it just meant that compared to some more new novel experiences I played this year, it didn't make the cut. Again, easy recommendation. If you haven't played it, I would recommend starting with the first just because the story does carry over. But both games, I think, are 100% worth a playthrough, and like I said, I think it's the fucking best game ever made. You know what I mean? I can't recommend it more enough. It's good. If you haven't played it, it's great. But I mean, fucking everybody knows about this game. Like, you have to live under a rock to have not have heard of this. All right. You've either already probably played it or decided that you're not, or probably more realistically don't have a PlayStation 5. So next up, that brings us to Tunic. All right, so Tunic is a cute little game. Top-down action adventure. Honestly, just like super Zelda-like is probably the quickest and easiest way to say it. Extremely charming. The fundamentals of the gameplay are super solid. Level design, art, music, all of it is fantastic. And if you're just someone who enjoys these sort of like top-down action games with like exploration elements, getting keys, like just all this sort of like explorations. Like if you look at the trailer, if this game seems like you might enjoy it, you will enjoy it. I'll just put it that way. It does pretty much all of the fundamentals really well. The twist to this game, and I think what makes it interesting, is it has almost a meta layer similar to games like Fez or The Witness through this handbook. So it has this sort of guidebook here, which is not only how it accesses the map, but all of the like gameplay information. And so there's this intentional obfuscation of information because the book is written in like an unknown language, and so you have to sort of like piece together information it doesn't necessarily outright tell you. It doesn't block you from knowing any of the fundamentals, but it's kind of cool because it sort of has a I want to say like Celeste-like element in the sense of there was things from the beginning that you could have always done, you just never knew how to do them. And by getting more information about the world, you understand the whole time, like, oh, I could have done this, and it recontextualizes information that you don't know how to interact with. And this takes it very much to the extreme that I think like Fez does, in that there's just some puzzles that 99.9% of the player population will not solve on their own, and they have to like look up a guide on how to do it. I also think that's fine. So if you're interested in that sort of like element of like deep puzzle solving, it's there. But honestly, you can complete the game, never even really pay attention to it, and still have a really good time, which is basically what I did. I thought the puzzles were kind of cool at the end, like much more like post-game content, but the game fundamentals here are very strong. So again, an easy recommendation, especially if you like top-down action sort of Zelda likes. We've done indie, AAA, indie. Time to go to AAA. Boom, Elden Ring honorable mention. Not one of my top 5 favorites. This probably won't be super surprising for those who saw my Elden Ring review. Basically, TLDR, and I actually don't even think I conveyed this super well in the review that I made, but I do think it's probably the best open world game ever made. I mean, what do I even need to fucking say about Elden Ring at this point, right? You either played it and you loved it, played it, thought it was okay, or haven't played it for some reason, but like, everyone's played it. And I think, for good reason. It's a good fucking game. In my video, I try to explain that, like, I personally didn't enjoy it as much given my expectations, but that doesn't mean it's like a bad game. As for why it's in my honorable mentions as opposed to my top 5 list, a couple of reasons, mostly just stemming from the fact that like I am a Soulsborne fan, and I don't think this was a very good Soulsborne game. I think the combat is some of the strongest it's ever been in the series. I think the boss design has some incredibly memorable moments compared to the rest of the series, but fundamentally the core pacing I think gets broken in terms of it being like a very like handcrafted experience due to going to the open world. And I also think like some of the balancing gets thrown off a little bit in terms of like how diluted the content is, how repetitive some of the side content is as well, and just the balancing as far as like level scaling in an open world goes, as someone who specifically explored it quite a bit. So yeah, I won't rehash it, I'll just end there, but if you do want to hear more of my thoughts as a longtime Soulsborne fan, would definitely check out my Elden Ring video. Plug. Next up in my honorable mentions list is BPM bullets per minute. So this game I think is the most flawed game on this list, or objectively bad, in that if you're looking at the trailer or you've heard of this game before, you probably didn't play it because it looks like the visuals are shit, and they are. I actually would go as far as to say that this game is unplayable on the base settings, and without tweaking some of the visual elements in the settings, it's just gonna give you a headache, which is like, what? How could anybody have enjoyed that experience, right? That's what I thought going into it. I tweaked some of the settings. I held off on buying it for a decent amount of time because of like how bad everyone said the visuals were. And like they are, but after tweaking it, the gameplay is fucking insane. It is some of the best game feel I've ever played in a video game. Very like I'd say old school, sort of like Doom style, just like fast paced arena shooter combat. And it is a rhythm FPS, which to me makes it even greater. So the whole gimmick is that you can only fire or reload or dash on the beat. And I think this is the best implementation of a rhythm FPS I've ever played. And I just wish the visuals had just didn't look so ugly, because this game feels fucking amazing to play. So another criticism I'll just say real quick is there's basically only 4 levels. Like you can beat this game entirely in like an hour. So like you don't have much to lose if you're just looking to like get into it. But I played it for 18 hours because it was that fun. So I think that, like, to me, that's like one of the biggest compliments you can give a game, is just like playing it to death, because it's just so much fun. And this game is really, really fun. I should also mention it's roguelike. So I'm not a huge roguelike fan, and I also enjoyed it. But if you are a roguelike fan, well, congratulations. It's probably one of the best FPS roguelikes ever made, which is crazy because it fucking looks like shit. And lastly, in honorable mentions is Stray, the cat game. Again, a game that I'm pretty sure everyone who's watching this video knows about, and probably already has an opinion on. I largely enjoyed it and almost made my top 5 list. It got beat out at the end of December due to some other games that I played. And the number one reason, and I haven't heard a lot of people talk about this, but it really resonated for me, is immersion. I actually think there's a couple of pieces to this game, specifically the visuals and the audio, that actually felt truly next gen in terms of the presentation. And to me, one of the greatest things a game can do is immerse the player, either through their gameplay or their story. And to me, this game had such beautiful art direction and design, and just graphical like limit testing and immersive audio experience, that there was a huge sense of place to the world that really enraptured me and wanted me to explore it as much as possible. That said, I think it's actually just like a pretty overhyped game in a lot of ways. There's a lot of people who are just like, go, oh my god, cat, buy it and enjoy it, and like that's fine if that's the case. But as a gamer who cares about gamer things, I actually think the core gameplay is like pretty whatever. I think it's innovative to some degree in terms of how you navigate the environment from the perspective of a cat, so I give the game some credit for that. But a lot of the traditional game elements, like there's some stealth pieces or like some quests, those are kind of like whatever. I also think the story is pretty whatever. But I think this game has enough interesting pieces going for it, especially if you like something new and novel, because this is also not something I've ever experienced before due to like the cat-based platforming mechanics, that it's hard to go wrong. Plus the game is like what, like 8 hours? Like, you know, it's you're not losing much by giving it a shot if it at least looks interesting to you. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was nice. I also wish there was more critical analysis other than just cute cat game. But that doesn't matter because it sold like fucking bananas. Next up is my favorite DLC, which was Cuphead, The Last Course. So, again, you've probably heard of Cuphead, or at least seen it. It's the one that looks like an old school cartoon. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is to say about it. Like the side-scrolling shooter action is like pretty solid and pretty fun. I think the thing that will make people not play this game is it is actually somewhat difficult. As someone who's like a decent gamer, I had trouble with it, and it was on the more challenging side of things. But I mean, the reason why you play this game is not for the gameplay, it's for the fantastic, literally one of a kind in gaming visuals of this sort of like, you know, the attention to detail and thoroughness and the animation, the presentation of these boss fights is just like nothing else in gaming. And like I said, like the gameplay is like pretty solid, so it's not like bad either. But yeah, if you're looking for like a little bit more of a challenging experience with a extremely unique visual style, there you go. And I'll just say that as for the DLC itself, I think it's actually almost better than the base game in terms of like the design elements. in terms of like some of the combat fights. So it was a fantastic DLC. Took a while for them to release compared to when the first game came out. All right. We've gotten through the honorable mentions. We've gotten through the DLC. Time to get into my top 5 favorite games that I played in 2022. Number 5. Dying Light 2. This will probably be surprising for a decent amount of people. It's probably also one of the games that's sitting at, I would say, the lowest Steam ratings that I'll have on this list. It's 79%, but honestly, it was really fun. So the pitch for this game, and the reason why I enjoyed it is Mirror's Edge, the open world game. And I know they already made a Mirror's Edge open world game, and it wasn't very good. As a fan of parkour simulators, for lack of a better term, meaning that it is a movement-based system that tries to be immersive and like based in realism, or like based in a like first-person perspective, which is what what Mirror's Edge offered. They combine that with actual like really good open world design that facilitates that movement system, which is not what happened in the Mirror's Edge open world game. And so, yeah, decent story, nothing to write home about. Gameplay is, again, like the combat system is decent, has like RPG. It's, generic open world game, but the core like premise of an open world game focused on a really satisfying movement system is really good here. And particularly in the later half of the game, some of the tools that you unlock are just really fucking fun to use. There's just a bunch of tools that you can unlock that are based in like realism or like immersion that actually make the flow of movement super, super satisfying. And so I think it gets elevated by nailing the thing that I think is most important here, and everything else is not bad. Not really a standout, but not bad. I'll also say just at the end, there's also some really cool scripted moments in the story as well. There's some genuine memorable moments, I think, coming out of the game. So credit to the game on some of the other pieces. Next up, number 4. Demon Souls, the remake. So, surprise, surprise, I'm a Soulsborne fan. And you know what is a good game? Demon Souls. I didn't know this because I never played the original because it came out on, I want to say, the PS2. So pretty old game that I don't think most people would have access to at this point if they tried to play it now. So good thing there's a remake. Now, the joke of that is on PlayStation 5, so not many people would have access to it now. But yeah, so I enjoyed this actually more than Elden Ring, which immediately I think is going to get people yelling at me, but fuck you. I'm right about these things. Grr. Okay, so why is Demon Souls better than Elden Ring? A couple of reasons. I'll say visually, the remake is actually phenomenal. So similar to Stray in terms of the visuals being so good, it elevated the experience in a way that made it feel really immersive and or like next-gen cutting edge. I also think Demon Souls surprisingly hits that bar for me. As someone who plays a lot of games, I think it takes a lot for the visuals to like really impress me. But this and Stray both managed to achieve that. Like this game just fucking looks gorgeous. But visuals are not the most important thing in a Soulsborne game. The gameplay is, the combat is, the level design is, and all of that is phenomenal. I'd say it has everything you love about the Soulsborne combat. Game feel is fantastic, very purposeful, very like committed in terms of the actions, very crisp animations. Goes for almost all of the Soulsborne series. But to me, this gave me what Elden Ring did not, which is like very tight level design, very good pacing, and honestly, I'd say some of the remade bosses and some of the levels in terms of like how they were sort of modernized and tightened up are some of the best in the entire series. And so Demon Souls to me is one of the better games in all of the official Soulsborne mainline series. I really enjoyed it. Not my favorite in the entire series, but like if you literally were just like, hey, I enjoyed Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, and you would love another one of those, and like the open world of Elden Ring didn't quite do it for you in the same way that it didn't quite do it for me, like boom, Demon Souls. It's fucking great. It has problems. Specifically, I'll say that the grass system that gets later entries gets turned into the Estus Flask system. I'll just say that change is very obvious. Like it just improves the game. because otherwise you can stockpile healing, which is never good. The world tendency system is also like really obscure, even for a Dark Souls game. So like for most people who play it, like they won't even realize it exists or like understand it at all or have any ability to interact with it. Like that's how obscure it is, but it really doesn't impact things when you play it, so it doesn't really matter. Great level design, fantastic core combat, and some of the best visuals out there. Solid recommend for those of you who have a PlayStation 5. This brings us to number 3. Lost Ark. So Lost Ark is a game that is hard for me to fully recommend. I mean, just look at these recent reviews, 65%. Wow, 71%. Okay, so pretty low. Before I get into the downsides, because I think there are some very legitimate ones, a couple of things. One, this is a ARPG MMO, which I have not experienced a lot of. But if you don't know what that means, think like Diablo-style combat, but in an MMO. And I'll just say the reason why this is number 3 is twofold. One, I played this game more than any other game in 2022 by a metric fuck ton. I have over 1,000 hours in this game, which is like 10x the hours of every other game on my list, and maybe like triple all of the other games on my list combined in terms of hours that I poured into this. It's an MMO, makes sense. And 2, it is the most fun that I've had in an MMO since World of Warcraft, which, as someone who's played World of Warcraft on and off over the course of more than a decade, I think is a really good compliment, because I've tried a lot of other MMOs. I've tried Final Fantasy. I've tried Guild Wars. I've tried WildStar. I've tried Rift. All of these like old MMOs that have sort of come and gone over the years. To me, Lost Ark was the one that got me as addicted as original World of Warcraft. And so let's talk about the good things. One, it is the combat just feels really like fresh. Like the ARPG combat feels super engaging, and like is very well paced. Essentially, you have 8 abilities that you can rotate through, and it means that you're constantly making impactful small decisions around your rotation and managing cooldowns in a way that I think like a traditional sort of like a hotkey MMO misses to some degree. 2, I think the visuals, which is a theme of some of my other favorite games on this list, feel really cutting edge. I think this game has some of the best visual design of any MMO I've ever played and feels up there with a single player like game. So I think that's really impressive, considering MMOs tend to dial it back so that more people, so that their game is more accessible. And then 2 is the actual story and side content. So this game has a fuck ton of side content, and as a completionist who enjoys experiencing everything the game has to offer and is less concerned about the end game, this game absolutely nails it. I'd say you can play 600 hours of this game before you get to the end game, and it is content that I found was fun and worth doing, which is not true of a lot of other MMOs that I can't even get to level cap for because the content is so boring and so dry. So I think it's a credit to this game that it actually has pretty good story and side content that feels like it's still progressing your character in meaningful ways. On the story element, I will say that there are several moments in this game. Basically every like main quest line ends with this epic mission. Has provided some of the most memorable experiences in gaming for me, and rivals some of the most epic moments in single-player games. So the way that I would basically frame it is that this game is probably the most single-player MMO that I've ever played, and as someone who tends to play MMOs kind of by myself more often than not, I reaped all of the benefits associated with that. I will say downside of that is if you are interested in more of the social aspect, it's probably not going to be as good for you, but it worked out for me. All of those things are reasons why I liked it a lot. I do not think most people who seek MMOs will like this game, because I think the end game is kind of hit and miss. So specifically, this game's monetization system is, I think, probably the most predatory that I've seen. In any MMO that I've played, and I don't play a lot of like Korean super grindy MMOs, right? So like people who are more familiar with that side of gaming is probably much more familiar with this. But essentially the monetization is straight pay to win. You can get better gear if you just pour in money, and progression is very grind based, which is like why it's also pretty hard to recommend, because you will hit a point where you either have to log in every single day to do grindy and repetitive content, and or just throw hundreds of dollars at the game in order to progress and skip it. I chose not to do that. I basically noped out. I tried to grind for like a month, maybe 2 months, Was very slow, wasn't very fun, and then have basically churned out of the game since then. And I don't know realistically if I'll ever really return to the game either, so that 1,000-hour mark probably isn't ever really going to go up. But during my time with the game, I very, very much enjoyed it. And one of the appeals is that I've heard from a lot of other people that the end game content is really good. I didn't get to experience a lot of it myself because I sort of burnt out before then, but if you want a more action-based MMO raid system, then there you go. Also, as a final note here, if you want to hear more of my thoughts in depth, I made a way too fucking long, hour-long video talking about every element of the game in detail and why it was interesting for me as someone who came from a lot of different MMOs in terms of what this game offered that other MMOs that I had played had not. So I think there's a lot of meat to this game, a lot of interesting things about it, but at the end of the day, I played over 1,000 hours of this game last year, and I enjoyed a solid 600, 700 of them. So it got some things right. Number 2, the penultimate game of the year, Solar Ash. Have you heard of this game? If not, you're in for a treat. Solar Ash. So this is by a company called Heart Machine, who you may know, who made Hyper Light Drifter, another game that I really enjoyed. So, what is Solar Ash? The pitch. It is Sonic the Hedgehog combined with Shadow of the Colossus, meaning it is a fast-paced platforming game with some light combat elements at quite a large scale. To me, I heard that pitch and was like, all right, kind of sounds like my shit. Kind of sounds like my jam. And similarly to some of the other games that I mentioned on this list, the game feel is fucking phenomenal. You basically glide through the world on literal clouds, and my god, does it feel good. So this is a pretty short game, and I think around like 8 to 10 hours max. And I played it, I think 3 to 4 times total, just because the gameplay was so good. It's pretty simple. These small sort of like mini open world areas or levels. Open world feels wrong because they're not really that large. It's more like freeform areas with some smaller objectives that allowed you to just kind of glide through, collect some objects, and just explore. It's essentially, if you also another game that I think is very similar to is actually Mario Galaxy in terms of like how it does planets and gravity. But yeah, if you want a game where you are just straight gliding through the world and you enjoy really good movement systems, this game is butter. It is so smooth. It's so sad, honestly, that this game doesn't have more reviews or like didn't break through, because this game is, I think, phenomenal. One of my favorite indie games that I've ever played. And really, really recommend just like watching somebody stream this game, just checking out the gameplay, because I think you'll find out pretty immediately whether it's something that interests you or not. Visual style also, I'll say, is very striking. Story is kind of whatever. I think it's probably one of the weaker elements in this game, but if you like really good movement systems and or schmovement, this game's got schmovement, let me tell you. Which brings us to my personal favorite game of 2022. What could it be? He already got rid of Elden Ring and God of War. Could it be Horizon? No, I didn't play Horizon. It's an indie game. Of course it is. I love indie games. You should know that about me. And it is specifically a game that goes by the name of Melatonin. Another game you probably haven't heard of. But let me tell you why this was my favorite game that I played in 2022. So, it is a rhythm game in the most explicit terms. There are only 4 buttons in the game, no movement controls, and all you do is hit the button it tells you to hit on the beat. That's it. Very simple at first glance, but this game not only nails all of the important fundamentals of that concept, it fully explores them to a depth that I really appreciated. So this is not a very wide game, but a very focused and deep game. And the attention to detail and personality and just effort that went into every single level of this game is nothing but admirable. they try hard the fuck out of this, put so much care and attention to every single level, and it just oozes throughout the experience. So let me dive into a little bit of more of what that means. So this game handles challenge not in the complexity of the inputs. So for example, like Osu, which is very demanding, is very simple in terms of the controls, and it doesn't require a lot of rapid inputs. Instead, it uses visual information as a way to throw the player off and add challenge. So in other words, there's a very layered progression system in terms of mastery over a level, where it'll basically start out easy, you have complete visual information to get the ropes, and then the challenge mode for each level is it'll obscure information. So in other words, each level has a customized visual sort of like cue to go with the audio cues of when you should input the buttons. And on the harder challenge levels, it will occasionally obscure the visual information to kind of throw you off. So you have to lean back on the audio information in order to make sure that you time all of the inputs correctly. And to me, there are a lot of really cool things that they ended up doing in terms of how that dynamic sort of works together. And it even builds on this concept even further in terms of how each level is organized into chapters, and each chapter has a boss that is a combination of all of the levels in the chapter mushed together. So it feels like it's a real test of like skill in terms of like, cool, drilling the concepts of each level into you within a level in terms of how the difficulty progresses, and then throwing it all together and testing your collective mastery of each of the levels in the chapter. And what all of that means is that their game design fundamentals of how to build skill, how to challenge a player in meaningful ways that doesn't feel frustrating, is on fucking point. And this game is such a like just perfect example of what solid game design fundamentals can get you, combined with a lot of charm and personality put into every level. So for example, in some of the, like, I haven't really talked about it, but the visuals here are straight out of lo-fi, right? Extremely eye-catching, and each level has a lot of attention to detail and charm into it. And not only are the visuals completely unique, but the audio also, the music itself, is tied into the visual aesthetic of the level. So to me, one of the most memorable levels in the game is this level right here. So in other words, you have to use the visual information of these little dialogue boxes that sort of hover down while the camera pans to different desks. And so there's like the movement of like trying to track the visual information of these boxes. But the audio design is all of the expected sounds that you would hear in an office. So fax machines, landline cell phones going off, people typing on their computers. All of these levels have completely custom audioscapes that reinforce the visual aesthetic of the level, and the visuals provide unique challenges in terms of how to actually engage the player with its simple mechanics. So in this one, I mentioned that it's panning around. This one uses clouds to obscure some of the visual information. This one, you hop to each cell phone, and so there's horizontal movement that you have to keep track of. There's so much. This one has enemies come at you from this from the left part of the screen, so you have to sort of like you get like short notice, but you know kind of what to look for. And the music is also bangers. Like the soundtrack is also very good. This is a very, very, very simple game, very short, but it is so tightly designed with so much charm, so much personality, so much strong fundamental understanding of what makes a game engaging and not frustrating, that it manages to do so much with so little. And it just is a incredibly deep experience that I just played and was like, wow, this game is my favorite game of 2022. And I also recommend you check it out. There it is, my top 5 games of 2022. Several of them did come out in 2022. I think Lost Ark, Melatonin, Solar Ash. I don't think Demon Souls did. I think Dying Light did. So most of the games did come out in 2022. But yeah, if you know the type of games I like, there's probably nothing too surprising on this list. But I mean, hey, I like to try to provide an interesting perspective, right? You're not usually you're not going to see like the most popular AAA game on my list. And my hope, again, as I said at the beginning, is to expose you to new video games that hopefully sound interesting and exciting to you, and that with any luck, you'll check out and hopefully enjoy. So that has been the video. Thank you so much for watching. Really appreciate it. Hope you have an excellent rest of your day, evening, whatever. And yeah, goodbye.